The sterile scent of the hospital filled the air as a small boy sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the entrance. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed his face, but he didn't blink. He was waiting, just like he did every day, every week, every month. 12-year-old Daniel had been battling a rare muscular disease since birth. Most of his life had been spent within hospital walls, but his greatest battle wasn't against his illness or the pain. His greatest battle was loneliness. His mother had done everything she could to stay by his side for years, but his father, he had left when things got tough. Daniel turned to the nurse with a hesitant voice. "Did my dad come today?" The nurse smiled gently, but there was sadness in her eyes. "Maybe tomorrow, sweetheart." Daniel lowered his head. He knew his father wouldn't come, but still, every day, he looked at that door. Because without hope, what did he have left? And that day, someone walked through the hospital doors. But it wasn't the person he had been waiting for. Robert Downey Jr. had arrived. The hospital director and nurses watched as Robert walked through the corridors. No one knew exactly why he was there, but he had followed a story he had seen on social media. As he approached Daniel's room, his heart grew heavier. A child was waiting for his father to walk through the door, but that door remained empty. When he stepped inside, Daniel's eyes widened in shock. You're Iron Man," the boy whispered. Robert smiled gently and sat on the edge of the bed. "Today, I'm just Robert, but from what I've heard, you're the real hero here." Daniel grinned shyly, but his smile quickly faded into something more serious. "If my dad could see me, do you think he'd think I'm a hero too?" Robert felt his chest tighten. "There's no reason your father wouldn't be proud of you," he said softly. Daniel shook his head. "No, because he's not here." Then he said something that cut through Robert's heart like a knife. "He loved me less than the hospital bills." Robert averted his gaze. This child had learned one of the cruelest truths in the world. Sometimes even love had a price tag. But Robert wasn't going to let it end like this. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes filling with tears. But he didn't cry. "Every day I look at the door. Sometimes I ask my mom, 'Do you think he'll come back today?' But she just stays silent. And that silence, that's the cruelest way to tell me he never will." Robert swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "Maybe he won't come back, Daniel, but that doesn't mean you're loved any less." Daniel let out a small, broken laugh. "If this is love, I wish it felt different." Robert shook his head slightly. "Maybe you should stop looking for love in people who left and start seeing the love in those who stayed." Daniel locked eyes with Robert. For the first time, he felt truly seen. And at that moment, Robert made a silent promise. He wouldn't let this child feel alone ever again. Daniel had been talking to Robert for hours, but he wasn't curious about whether Robert was really Iron Man. He wanted to know something much deeper. "Are you here for me?" Daniel's eyes seemed to ask. "Or are you just here to do a good deed?" Seeing that uncertainty in the boy's gaze made Robert's heart ache. He glanced at the exhausted woman sitting in the corner, Daniel's mother. The dark circles under her eyes, the messy hair, the weight of sleepless nights. But when she looked at her son, there was an undeniable love in her eyes. She had fought for years, but life had worn her down. Robert leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Why isn't this boy's father in his life?" The woman hesitated for a moment. She lifted her eyes to Robert, but no words came out. She took a deep breath. Her voice cracked, because when the hospital bills became too much, he chose to leave. Robert clenched his fists. Daniel looked at his mother, biting his lip. "So, was I just a burden?" he whispered. His mother shook her head violently. "Never, don't you ever think that." But her voice wavered, and her eyes filled with tears. Daniel's own tears spilled down his cheeks, but he still left. "That means I wasn't worth staying for." Robert felt a lump in his throat. What Daniel had just said, this kind of heartbreak, was something no child should ever have to endure. Slowly, Robert knelt in front of the boy and took his small hands in his own. "What your father did doesn't define you," Robert said firmly. "It defines him. You weren't the one who left. He was the one who ran away. You were just a kid waiting to be loved." Daniel's small body trembled as he let out a sob. His tears fell freely now, tears he had been holding in for too long. Robert turned to look at Daniel's mother. She had covered her mouth with her hand, struggling to hold back her own cries. "Who was supposed to be strong?" Robert asked her. "Him or you?" The woman averted her gaze. Her voice was laced with quiet defeat. "I've always been strong," she admitted. "But sometimes, no matter how strong you are, there are burdens you can't carry alone." Robert turned back to Daniel. The boy was still staring at him, but now there was something else in his eyes, a desperate kind of hope. He didn't need a superhero. He needed someone to look at him and say, "I'm here." And at that moment, Robert made his decision. For the first time in his life, this boy was going to have a real father figure. Daniel's biological father had abandoned him, but Robert wouldn't, because real family wasn't just about blood, it was about the ones who chose to stay. The next morning, Daniel woke up to find his hospital room filled with flowers. Beside him lay a piece of paper, a receipt showing that his medical bills had been paid in full. His mother sat at the edge of his bed, clutching the document in her trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. But that wasn't the real surprise. The door swung open, and in walked Robert, holding a neatly wrapped package. Daniel's eyes lit up with excitement. "What's that?" Robert smiled. "I got you a new Iron Man suit." Daniel's hand shook as he unwrapped the package. Inside was a specially designed Iron Man jacket. He ran his fingers over the fabric, barely believing it was real. When he was younger, he had dreamed of his father getting him an Iron Man costume. He had waited for the day his dad would surprise him with it, but that day never came. And now, standing before him, was not just a man. He was a real-life hero. But Robert wasn't finished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ticket, handing it to Daniel. "You know," Robert said, kneeling beside him, "the Avengers are welcoming a new member to the team. Would you like to meet them?" Daniel's eyes widened in disbelief. "Are you serious?" Robert grinned. "You, my friend, are a hero bigger than any of them. And heroes never stand alone." Daniel's eyes welled up, but this time it wasn't from sadness, it was joy. For years, he had waited for someone to tell him that he mattered, that he wasn't just a sick boy in a hospital bed. And now, Robert hadn't just given him a gift, he had given him an identity, a sense of worth, a family. His mother wiped her tears and looked at Robert with disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Robert gently ruffled Daniel's hair and replied softly, "Because sometimes, even heroes need saving too." That day, Daniel didn't feel like a sick child in a hospital room. He felt like a superhero. But Robert wasn't done yet. He had already spoken with Daniel's mother. He had helped her find a stable job, ensuring that she would never have to struggle alone again. He had paid off the hospital bills, giving her peace of mind. But most importantly, he had given them something they had lost long ago: hope. As Robert stood to leave, Daniel suddenly grabbed his hand and looked up at him. "Can I call you Dad?" Robert hesitated for a moment. His eyes softened as he blinked back emotion. Then, he gave Daniel a warm smile. "I may not be your father," he said, "but I will always be your family." Daniel nodded, a spark of happiness in his eyes.